Dear friends, tonight I want to talk about three poets, Kathleen Raine, Novalis, and William Blake. We've talked about Novalis and William Blake quite a bit in past meetings, most especially about Novalis. Blake and Novalis were contemporaries, and I often refer to them as spiritual brothers, although of course they never met or read the works of each other. Kathleen Raine is, of course, one of the outstanding Blake scholars of the 20th century, and we talked about her scholarship in past meetings prior to COVID. Tonight, I invite her back to our meetings. I don't think she knew much about Novalis. She was strongly rooted in the poetry of England and not as well read in German early Romantic poetry and literature, the literary source spring of anthroposophy. In fact, to my knowledge, Kathleen Raine never concerned herself with anthroposophy, although she certainly had read widely in the literature of theosophy, and she spoke about the Theosophical Enlightenment in relation to Blake and other poets such as Yeats. Now, this points to an awkward and unfortunate literary disjunction between theosophy and anthroposophy, and that's one reason I want to include Kathleen Raine tonight, along with Novalis and Blake. Another reason that I invite her is because she was a poet and a scholar, and that is what I think we try to do in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. We strive to bring together the artist, poet, and the scholar-scientist, the spiritually and bodily awake poet, and the rationally awake scientific thinker. Now here's a fragment by Novalis that we used at the opening of our meeting tonight. The literary arts. Everything that a scholar does, says, speaks, suffers, and hears, etc., must be an artistic, technical, and scientific product, or some such operation. He speaks in epigrams. She acts in a play. He is a dialoguist. She lectures on treatises and sciences. He relates anecdotes, stories, fairy tales, novels. She perceives poetically. If he draws sometimes as an artist, sometimes as a musician. Her life is a novel, and that's why she sees, hears, and reads everything precisely in this manner. In short, the true scholar is the completely developed human being who bestows on whatever they touch and do a scientific, idealistic, and syncretistic form. Kathleen Raine, to my mind, is a helpful example of the literary and spiritual ideal that Novalis expresses here. She was a poet. She trained as a scientist, and she forged a career and reputation as a literary scholar. Thanks to her tireless scholarly interpretive work on William Blake and others, she has kept alive for many people an appreciation of poetry as an inspired spiritual activity. Kathleen Raine reminded many readers that the materialist worldview of positivist scientism is a very recent cultural aberration, a proud bully inflated with Faustian ambitions of narcissistic grandeur. Kathleen Raine has tirelessly reminded readers that there is an older, quieter, more authentic spiritual view of the world and the human being that aligns with the poetic spiritual teachings of many ancient earth cultures and civilizations. A view of the human universe that she called tradition, or others have called the perennial philosophy, or theosophy, or anthroposophy, or the lost wisdom of the imagination. all these being various ways of reminding us that the spiritual world is in fact already open to us. It is always open. If we were to suddenly become so plastic to perceive it, we would perceive ourselves in a spiritual world. Now, another reason that I have invited Kathleen Raine into our meetings is that I think it is important that our section face outward toward the world and welcome new colleagues, past and present, who might not be aware of anthroposophy or who might be inclined to avoid or reject anthroposophy or Rudolf Steiner for a variety of well-considered social, political, historical, or cultural reasons, even though those friends may be what anthroposophy fondly likes to call Michaelic souls. Finally, I also think that Kathleen Raine's work, her example, and her outlook on the human being, poetry, and spirit can help us in our literary section to articulate a methodology. That is to say, help us to explain to ourselves and to others how we work with literature and the humanities, and what is it that we bring to the table that is uniquely of value. You know, we've had this discussion about methodology in several meetings over the years. For example, when I discussed literature within the context of spirit remembering. At that time, I discussed the idea that the reading of literature, the study of literature, the doing of literature can foster what persons in an earlier century like to call clairvoyance. That is to say, clear seeing, abilities to empathically dialogue with other places, other beings, other cultures, other times, other minds. Now, it's not as mysterious or woo-woo as it sounds. In fact, it's something that happens all the time, one might argue, when we play with literature or practice the various arts. It's a feature of our human beingness in the world. And we talked about this when Fred Dennehy and I spoke about Shakespeare, for example, and Shakespeare's ability to get outside his own personality, to inhabit other minds, other places, other cultures, other times. This capacity of the imagination is a quality that Keats, the poet, called negative capability, and Keats referred explicitly to Shakespeare as his example. Now, as you know, Rudolf Steiner never gave a course of lectures for our section, as he did, for example, for speech and drama, or eurythmy, or pedagogy, etc. Perhaps he didn't have time to do this before he died, or perhaps, as a senior colleague and mentor said to me several times, perhaps Steiner thought that since we are a section for poets, we should be competent to figure this all out for ourselves. After all, Rudolf Steiner had enormous confidence in poet, novelist, playwright Albert Steffen, and he made the comment that, quote, Albert Steffen was an anthroposophist before he was even born, which raises the interesting question. Can one be inspired by anthroposophia without being a student of Rudolf Steiner? Does Rudolf Steiner equal anthroposophia? Is Rudolf Steiner our only access point to anthroposophia? Or is Rudolf Steiner one voice and one viewpoint in a greater, more encompassing spiritual tradition, variously known, variously explored, and variously beckoning? Now, you might want to debate that question, But before we go down that path, let me answer the other question. Why didn't I choose Albert Steffen for tonight's discussion as an example of a poet-scholar instead of Kathleen Raine? Albert Steffen's work and life trajectory is, after all, quite similar to Kathleen Raine's in a literary sense and in respect to the modernist moment of the 20th century. But my answer tonight is, number one, Albert Steffen is almost completely unknown to contemporary English readers. And in fact, these days he is quite unfamiliar, if not unknown, to many German readers. And two, Albert Steffen is intimately connected to the very challenging and difficult history of the Anthroposophical Society. And this makes it tricky to approach him, especially for those who don't read German, who don't have a scholarly familiarity with the history of the Anthroposophical Society in respect to the social, political, cultural turmoil of the early 20th century. Now again, you might challenge me and ask, okay, why then didn't I choose Friedrich Hebel as an example instead of Kathleen Raine? Hebel took over the section after Steffen's death, as you most certainly know, and my response is, while I greatly admire Friedrich Hebel, and I have indeed benefited enormously from his scholarship, Hebel was not a practicing poet or novelist or dramatist, as was Albert Steffen. Now, that's not a criticism, since, as you know, I am a retired university professor, and our section is a home for professors of literature and humanities and other academic disciplines, as it should be. But speaking now as a poet and as a novelist, instead of a university professor, you know I wear several hats, I think it is too easy and misleading to define our section as an academic enterprise solo. We should, I believe, reserve an important place at our round table for the art and doing of poetry, for the poet. But what do I mean by poetry? Thus, I return to Kathleen Raine, a poet-scholar who explored this important question, what is poetry, extensively during her lifetime. She is an excellent teacher in that respect. And moreover, her attempt at a definition aligns with attempts by poets such as Novalis and William Blake and many others that we have discussed in our meetings. Now, I wrote about this in the afterword to the fairy tale Atlantis by Novalis, where I mentioned Kathleen Raine and quoted her. And in that afterword to this very important fairy tale by Novalis, I referred to a passage from the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, in which we find the Atlantis fairy tale as Chapter 3. In the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, the young hero Heinrich, age 20, and Heinrich's mother are on a journey to the mother's homeland to meet Heinrich's maternal grandfather. More than a union, however, this journey to the mother's homeland is a quest to discover what it means to be a poet in a spiritual sense. Heinrich's maternal grandfather keeps a splendid court, we are told. And here in that court, as with the court described in the fairy tale Atlantis, poetry and poets are fostered and celebrated. During the journey, Heinrich has adventures that teach him about his destiny as a poet, and the fairy tale Atlantis is one such teaching that he receives at the start of the journey. Heinrich's education as a poet reaches a high point when he arrives at his grandfather's court and meets the master poet Klingsor. Klingsor receives Heinrich as his pupil and lineage heir, and Heinrich marries Klingsor's daughter Matilda. Then throughout the novel, we find many examples of poetry and hear much talk about poets. In Chapter 2, for example, the merchants tell the story of Arion, the legendary Greek inventor of dithyrambic poetry. The fairy tale Atlantis follows immediately after that. Chapter 2, Arion, and Chapter 3, Atlantis, are balanced by Chapters 8 and 9, in which the master poet Klingsor appears and gives instruction. In Chapter 9, Klingsor performs the fairy tale of Eros and Fable as a masterpiece and masterclass. And this grand fairy tale completes the first phase of Heinrich's education as a poet. In many respects, the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen is, as I've said many times, a how-to manual for those who wish to learn to become magical idealists. And we talked about this recently, and there are a series of video lectures about magical idealism on the website. Novalis lays out all the secrets right at the beginning of his novel when Heinrich describes his dream of the blue flower. A sweet sort of slumber overcame him, a sleep in which he dreamed incredible events. He awoke to another enlightening vision in which he found himself on a soft lawn at the edge of a spring. The spring gushed forth into open air and seemed to merge with it. Dark blue rocks with multicolored veins rose at a distance. The daylight was clear and mild, more so than usual, and the sky was dark blue, pristine and clear. But what compelled him most forcefully was the tall light blue flower. The flower stood next to the gushing spring. Its broad, shiny leaves teased the water. All around the flower were other flowers of many colors, oh, so many flowers, and the air had a delicious scent of perfume. He only had eyes for the blue flower. With tender yearning and unspeakable desire, he gazed upon it. At last, as he was about to stretch, the flower suddenly began to sway and shape-shift. The leaves brightened, they caressed the thickening stem. The flower bent toward him, and the petals swelled open like a collar to reveal a tender, hovering face. Two questions guide Heinrich when he awakens from this watery, sensuous, visionary experience. They are questions that Kathleen Raine often poses, namely, what does it mean to be a poet, and what is poetry in a human spiritual sense? At first, these questions remain vague and inarticulate, but as the journey progresses throughout Part 1 of the novel, Heinrich achieves an enlightened heart-mind understanding of the wonderful art of poetry. He gradually matures to a recognition that to become a poet means to realize one's innately human spiritual potential and to remember one's human alignment to an embodiment in a spiritual world. Now, what does this mean? The master poet Klingsor offers some insight in Chapter 8, where he says, "It is really quite unfortunate that poetry has a highbrow reputation, and that poets are set apart as special types. There is nothing so very mysterious about it. Poetry happens as a natural function of the human mind. Does not every human being strive and poeticize at every moment?" Let us linger for a moment on that final sentence and on the verb poeticize. In this sentence, Novalis points to the romantic understanding of imagination, a term celebrated by Kathleen Raine repeatedly in her writings and lectures. These days, because of scientism and its henchmen, known as materialist economics, we have a very cramped notion of the meaning of imagination. For many of us, to imagine means to conjure up something fantastical or unreal, something subjective and arbitrary. But Kathleen Raine reminds us that early romantics, such as Blake, had a radically different definition for imagination. Now, as you see from the quote here, imagination is synonymous with mind. If mind is understood in a spiritual context, for example, in the sense that contemporary Buddhist literature uses the word mind, or to frame things in the context of Romanticism, Coleridge referred to imagination, mind, as that esemplastic power. Now, esemplastic power is an awkward term that sets off very few firecrackers today. But in fact, this attempt by Coleridge to define mind imagination is right in sync with Blake and Novalis and many other poets of the tradition, as Kathleen Raine calls it. Novalis asserts in the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen that it is by means of our free poetic attention, or imagination, that esemplastic power, that the human being interprets her life world and finds her way home. According to Klingsor, the human being is not a passive recipient of sensory stimuli knocked about willy-willy. No, we are active makers, whether we know it or not, intimately involved with the world-creating, world-renewing affair of knowing and remembrance. There's nothing so very mysterious about it, says Klingsor. As we live and strive, imagination weaves meaning like a poet crafting a poem, for better or for worse, I suppose one might add. Kathleen Raine reminds us that William Blake called the poet an awakener, and to what are we awakened? In her essay, What is the Use of Poetry, in her book, That Wondrous Pattern, she attempts several explanations. Here's a quote. Blake called the poet the awakener, for is there not in all of us something we feel we have forgotten, which we seek to retrieve from our unawareness, to remember, as Plato says? Plato's word is anamnesis, which means literally unforgetting. For Plato taught that the soul knows everything but has in this life forgotten what it knows in eternity. Inspired poetry awakens us to the recollection of what is already within us, bringing with it a kind of recognition as if we had already always known these things. Inspired poetry is not difficult in the sense of requiring many notes before we can understand it. On the contrary, what is inspired from this deep source comes with a sort of simplicity, like the music of Bach or a melody of Schubert, a sense of familiarity like the landscapes and fools and angels of Cecil Collins, almost one might say of a homecoming to our native country. So what then do we make of this reference to Atlantis as the title of that magical idealist fairy tale by Novalis? Well, if knowledge is remembrance, as Plato taught, and if meditation and memory perch like Odin's ravens on our human poet shoulders, then perhaps the mention of Atlantis is a reminder to awaken to spirit remembrance, and thereby to romanticize the world. Now we see the true bonds of subject and object. We see that there is also an external world inside of us that is connected to our internal side, which is analogous to the connection of the external world outside us to our external side. And we see that the former and the latter are connected just as are internal and external sides. Likewise, we hear throughout Blake's poetry that same insistent drumbeat to remembrance, urging us to wake up to the full potential of our inborn human poetic nature. The materialist prison that appears to confine us so tightly is, in fact, not imposed by mysterious others, but it is one that we have built skillfully and magically ourselves. It is, you might say, and I know this sounds odd and uber-romantic, but you might say it's bad poetry, a failure of imagination. Plato called the intellect the true human being, whereas for William Blake, imagination is the true human being. Imagination, brackets mind, is the human existence itself, and thus, in Blake's terms, the divine humanity. Now, to conclude this discussion for tonight, I've extracted just a few statements by Kathleen Raine for us to consider upon parting. I'm hoping that this very short selection will inspire you to travel a bit with Kathleen Raine. And a good place to begin that journey might be the book That Wondrous Pattern, which I referred to, and from which I extracted these quotes. Or you can find her explaining her own ideas in her own voice on YouTube. Tradition. I inherited in my measure the unbroken tradition of civilized Europe, as this has descended from Homer and the classical world through Rome and Christendom, and English literature from Chaucer to the 20th century, each age inheriting, building on, and adding to the heritage of the past. The past was, for the educated, and I say was, I hesitate to say is, an extended present in whose whole each generation lived. This idea of alignment with tradition is for some of us a very attractive proposition, and it's perhaps self-evident to some of us. It's an important word, tradition, especially in the modernist era of the early 20th century, in which, as I've said, one could contextualize both Rudolf Steiner and Kathleen Raine. But do we understand tradition historically as the Western literary tradition, Homer to Goethe, for example, or can we learn to speak in a more global and diversified sense? Do we have that spiritual agility yet? But there's another way to respond to this quote. And I mentioned this other response when I spoke about spirit remembering, and in previous meetings I pointed to Owen Barfield, a contemporary of Kathleen Raine. The human being is a time being. We are sometimes asked to say in a few words what anthroposophy is. It is, of course, impossible. But let us in this context say that the kernel of anthroposophy is the concept of the human being's self-consciousness as a process in time, with all that this implies. From a spiritual point of view, this notion of the human being as a time being opens many vistas. When we engage with a literary tradition, are we bounded by the relative limitations of our culturally, politically conditioned here and now? Or are we learning to grow wings of spirit that allow us to fluidly shape-shift into other times, other minds, other places, other humanities, other lifetimes? If indeed we are time beings, what is the role of spirit remembrance as we come to self-knowledge? From this standpoint, one might argue that tradition is not a set of canonical books by DWMs, but something more fluid and electric and eclectic, like nodal points of ley line energies to which we must learn to attune. Perhaps the voices that awaken us as we swim in particular rivers or estuaries of tradition, so to speak, might be thought of as vortices of spirit power, or, to shift the metaphor, energy nodes, such as we would find at ancient megalithic sites, power points where the veil between the worlds grows very thin, where one can hover and fluidly trespass many assumed boundaries, if one learns how. Or, to use the terminology of Novalis, if one has learned the art of magical idealism. What is a wisdom tradition of the being human? Kathleen Raine is well known for her Temenos Journal and Temenos Institute, which encourage the quest for the perennial wisdom tradition of the being human. But the main point that I want to hold in mind tonight as we close is that she says arts should properly be found within the precincts of the sacred. Key word here, sacred. But she says clearly that she does not mean sacred in a religious sense. Like William Blake, Kathleen Raine might be said to be Christic, but not Christian. Blake made frequent use of Christian vocabulary, but he was no friend of Christianity, and by that I mean no friend of the Christian religion. He was Christic, but not a Christian. How do we understand that distinction? Robert McDermott touched upon this a bit in his recent meeting presentations, and I refer you to those videos. And we discussed this distinction several times in our work with Novalis. To follow that thread just a bit farther, these days I sometimes find myself in literary conversation with persons who reflexively assume that sacred and secular are in opposition, that they point in different directions, that they are at loggerheads. But this is a blinkered and relatively recent materialist social-political reading of the term secular, and we need to be careful. If the word secular means that one is a crass materialist, how then can we say, for example, that the works of Shakespeare are foundational for the secular humanist literary tradition? How then, for that matter, can we say that Wolfram von Eschenbach's poem, Parzival, is a foundational text for the secular humanist European literary tradition that begins around and about the year 1200, at the same time as the building of the great European cathedrals? Anamnesis. All knowledge is remembrance. Inspired poetry awakens us to the recollection of what is already within us, bringing with it a kind of recognition as if we had always already known these things. What is inspired from this deep source comes with a sort of simplicity, almost one might say of a homecoming to our native country. Where are we going then? Always towards home. We'll have to look again in a later meeting at this Platonic, Neoplatonic idea, anamnesis, knowledge as remembrance, as we play with the theme of literature as a practice of spirit remembrance. Anamnesis is one of those Platonic themes that Kathleen Raine discusses repeatedly in that wondrous pattern. And as I mentioned, I made use of her discussion in my afterword to the fairy tale Atlantis. And again, I refer you to it, or at very least, you should listen to the performance video of Atlantis, since there you will find Novalis explaining in his own words his spiritual idea of poetry as a magical, idealist, human spiritual path. So, to wrap things up prior to our meeting discussion tonight, this final slide of quotations is where I will stop. One of the very first symptoms of the loss of the soul is the loss of the sense of beauty. The beautiful, then, is the active principle in any work of transforming power, summoning us to self-knowledge of the innate human norm to which we always tend, but from which we always deviate. And the greater the disparity between a sordid actuality and the perfection of the beautiful, the greater, not the less, is the need for the truth of beauty to rectify and inform the formless reality or unreality of the everyday world. It is by images of perfection alone that poetry transforms consciousness. Beauty binds the eye to the body. Personally, I find a great deal of inspiration in the fact that Rudolf Steiner emphasized that the name of our section in German is the section for the beautiful sciences. The German name, Beautiful Sciences, does not communicate at all very well in English, so it was changed to the Literary Arts and Humanities. Now, while it might appear that something has been lost with the English translation, I rather think not. The name of our section in English is more inclusive and comprehensible in the context of our early 21st century. Meanwhile, in the background, beauty like an ever-present spirit guide inspires our quest, our striving, and our methodology. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in Romanticism and for your interest in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. Good night.